All right, so here's what I'd like to propose to do. 2 o'clock was when Sue Colb was going to speak and give us a slideshow today. And what I'd like to do is, because she can't be here, I did finally hear from her just a short while ago. She took a picture and sent it of her extremely snowy backyard, and she's hacking her way through it, and it's a whole thing. And she's in upstate New York somewhere in Binghamton, I believe. So she's not able to be here, which is a shame because she's a very, very moving speaker, and her art is extremely moving. One thing I wanted to ask Kyle, is it possible for me to show things on the computer without interfering with the live feed?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, because what I want to do is, I wonder if maybe, Kyle, maybe you can even operate this. Just leave the camera fixed the way it is.
Sure.
And just look up Sue Colb art and see if you can just slowly bring up some images of her woodcuts and art. And what I want to do is, I want to read you something that, I'm sorry to spell it. It's S-U-E, and then her last name is C-O-E. And if you do Sue Colb art, you should probably find a lot of stuff. A lot of woodcuts, a lot of drawings.
Would you like me to, if you go through the talk, would you like me to choose the ones that...
Sure, absolutely. That would be great. If you can send it up for Gary, that would be great. There's a lot of great stuff. And if there's a way to display it on the screen, there we go. So, Gary, why don't you go through this? So right now the gallery is at Etienne in Manhattan, which is about 3 blocks straight up from Roma. There is a show called All New Art, and it's got art by Kate Colvitz, who's an early 20th century artist who did some very, very gripping images, including a very famous one called Krieg nie wieder, which means no more war, or literally war never again. And it's a woodcut of a woman with her fist raised in the air. Very moving stuff, and it was an interesting juxtaposition for the gallery to set up this show with works by Sue and by Kate Colvitz. And as Gary goes through some of these, I just want to read you some of what they have to say in the brochure about Sue that I picked up last Saturday at the show. Sue Colb is not of the art world. As a girl, she assumed she would become a factory worker like her mother, or a secretary. Art was her escape, at first emotionally and then literally, from a working class fate. When she was 17, she got a scholarship to attend the Chelsea School of Art in London, where she trained to be an illustrator. I knew I had to make a living at art, she said. No one was going to support me except myself. Illustration was one of the few career paths that was open to women. Children's books or greeting card illustrations or job-making wallpaper designs with the idea that flowers are female. In 1972, she moved to New York and began doing editorial illustration for the New York Times and similar publications. Designing for the printed page taught her to refine her visual messaging. She explains, if the images are not an effective lure, immediately compelling or accessible, the viewer will not consider reading the content. While then unfamiliar with Klinger's treatise, Painting and Drawing, Colb, like Kate Colvitz, instinctively understood that black and white is better suited to social criticism than color. Did Ben Shahn do stuff in black and white? I think he did. Colb had developed the first shreds of a political consciousness protesting the Vietnam War as a student in London. She remembers, I could see this was a moral stand, even though at the time I didn't know Colb from Groucho. In New York, she joined the Arts Club, a place where aging Marxists, many of them survivors of the Great Depression and the McCarthy-era blacklist, met to discuss politics and print posters in support of local issues like tenants' rights. She also broadened her aesthetic horizons, discovering the work of Daumier, Deeks, Goya, Gross, and of course Colvitz. And George Gross is somebody, if you're familiar with him, when you see Sue's art, I mean, he immediately comes to mind. Very, very gripping political artist in Germany, social critic of the Nazis and communists alike. Everybody was sort of a prime target for George Gross back in the 20s and 30s. Free of formalist dogma and its concomitant prescriptions, which still gripped American academia, Colb selected from the broad panoply of art history those influences that spoke to her. Tired of the constraints imposed by her editors, she also began choosing her own subjects and working on a larger scale. She made a reputation as an artist in the mid-'80s with canvases based on headline events, including the notorious pool table rape of a New Bedford woman, now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, and the subway vigilante Bernhard Goetz, some of you may remember if you're as old as me. However, again, like Colbitz, she preferred to work in series that facilitated a more in-depth exploration. She said, "My preference is to choose a topic or have it choose me and research it and do it well over a decade. Her approach is journalistic, and she likes to see her images accompanied by factual reportage, preferably in book form. In 1983, she published her first book with text by Holly Metz, How to Commit Suicide in South Africa. This and her next book, X, The Life and Times of Malcolm X, published in 1986, explored the relationship between racial prejudice and genocide. More generally, Coe's work has been an indictment of the ways in which capitalism subjugates the weak, dividing society into classes of oppressors and victims. Writing in the catalog of her 1987 to 89 traveling retrospective, Police State, the art historian Donald Cuspit credited the artist with creating, quote, a new genre somewhere between political cartoon and history painting. Essentially, Sue Coe picked up where Colbitz left off. Coe views herself as a witness who uses art to help serve justice and highlight the oppression that is concealed. Even in our media-saturated environment, there are incidents, such as police shootings or the so-called suicides of jailed anti-apartheid activists, that can only be recreated after the fact, and locations such as slaughterhouses where cameras are not allowed. There are also a great many horrific places, such as prisons, AIDS wards, and sweatshops that we know exist but prefer to ignore. Coe's job is to go there, observe, and record. She says, people think they can choose to be indifferent, and the filter of art is a useful veil to present the reality. It opens up a chance to have a dialogue where the viewer asks questions and is more open to the challenge of change. I'll just read a little bit more of this and then talk with you a little bit. For Coe, the predations of capitalism transcend the specifics of identity politics, uniting all socioeconomic minorities in common oppression. Growing up near a slaughterhouse on the outskirts of London, she came to view non-human animals as part of an overriding continuum of corporate violence. She says, we need economic, gender, and species equality. Today, the sort of widespread hunger depicted by Colbitz is rarely seen in developed nations, and Colbitz has a lot of really gripping images of people starving in alleyways and street corners and basements. Instead, we suffer from the problems of overproduction, which are subtler and more globally diffuse. Malnutrition, the destruction of indigenous crops, deforestation, and sweeping environmental degradation. Agribusiness and the meat industry are behind many of these calamities, Coe points out. She says, animal agriculture is among the leading causes of climate change. Animals, this is still Sue, animals as a class of beings are facing extinction. She sees farmed animals as analogous to the children in Colbitz's work, innocent creatures trod under by the malevolence of an unjust system, creatures that stand both for themselves and for the future in that their persecution reflects existential environmental concerns. And there's more in the brochure, there's a lot more in the show, which as I said runs till next Saturday, but I'm going to guess that you're getting a sense of what her art is like. And this is just looking at it on a slide screen. To actually see these artworks hanging on the walls is really powerful. And when you go and you see this exhibition, you really get a very, very palpable sense of the continuity and the commonalities between different forms of exploitation of sentient beings. As I said at the outset this morning, there is a very, very strong, overwhelming tendency in our society, just in virtue of being human, that we focus on the human, that we think about the problems of human exploitation in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of economic oppression, class oppression. But these are part of a much larger global phenomenon of exploitation and the infliction of violence that includes, at least in terms of sheer numbers of individuals, many, many times more non-human animals than the total number of human beings ever to have existed on the face of the earth. And it's very interesting how people who are very deeply concerned about human oppression stop at the boundary of the human and don't stop to think for a moment that this is just continuous with a much larger set of forms of oppression. And I think what accounts for that is what I started with this morning, our anthropocentric orientation, our fundamental focus on the human, and the historically layered prejudices according to which human beings are somehow different than non-human animals and somehow morally superior to non-human animals. It's surprising how often, even among highly intelligent, highly educated people, you hear the response, well, animals are just dumb animals, or they don't know what's happening to them. There was a retired biology professor at Bucknell, understandably I'm not going to name, and has been gone from here a long time, retired many years ago, not Professor Soika, who's also, or Dr. Soika, who's also a biologist as well as a former president of Bucknell, but this other biology professor got very angry at me at a party where I suggested that when people raise animals, even on so-called family farms, there's a kind of violence against non-human animals. And this professor's angry answer was, he says, so what exactly is it we're doing to them? I said, well, you know, we're confining them, we're delimiting their freedom, we're taking their choice away from them, and ultimately we're killing them. And he said something really angry to the effect, what's the matter with them just running around in a field? And that's the problem of focusing very narrowly and abstractly on little units of pleasure or little units of pain without thinking of them as little facets of a much larger whole life that individuals lead. Right? It's not just about whether they're running around in the field, it's under what conditions and to what end and with what terminus is awaiting them. And it's very hard to convince people about that. So that's some things that I wanted to share with you about Sue-Ko. I also wanted to talk about a few other things that have just sort of come up in the course of the day and some things that I didn't get an opportunity to talk about earlier that all kind of revolve around this question of continuity between human and non-human animal exploitation. The first thing I wanted to do that I didn't do this morning and I should have done, and I'm not going to take credit for thinking of this because Paula has been watching the live feed from over in the theater department and reminded me, I did not thank you all for coming, especially those of you who came from a long distance. And Ed, you're still here, right? And your students, some of your students are still here. Thanks for coming over from Westchester. Was it a hard drive?
It wasn't too bad. I left yesterday, stayed in Roseburg last night. The further I got from Westchester, the better the weather.
Yeah, and Gary came from down Malvern way. So yeah, we definitely appreciate your coming. And I'm glad that everybody is here today and actually sticking it out when there's so many other things that you could be doing on this warm sunny day. A couple of other things I wanted to just talk about. So, do you want to say that? No, I think okay. Just leave it up there if you want. Yeah. I wanted to go over just a couple of loose threads that have been floating around that some of you might not have picked up on. One of them is a discussion with Mike and Sherry. Gary Francione mentioned that he has a disagreement with Will Kimlicka. And a lot of you probably haven't heard of Will Kimlicka. Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka are the authors of a book called Zoopocalypse. And it's a very famous book. It's been very influential. It was published probably 10 years ago. It was published translated into many, many different languages. And Will Kimlicka is a professor of political theory up at Queen's University in funky Kingston, Ontario. And his sort of thinking is that you can use political theory that was designed for human relations and just include non-human animals in the political community. It's essentially treating non-human animals as citizens. And I think one of the things on which I certainly disagree with Kimlicka, and I think this is what the other Gary Francione was referring to, is you have to think about the question whether citizenship theory is the kind of theory that really works for creatures that aren't entirely like us. In certain respects, in terms of their moral status, they are very much like us. But in terms of the way that they order and conduct their lives, they may be very, very different from us. And the question you have to ask, if you like or find appealing the zoopolis citizenship idea, is if you treat animals like citizens, are we perhaps unwittingly doing violence to them by forcing human forms of self-understanding and human forms of relating and valuing onto creatures who may have a very, very different set of conceptions about what life is like and how you live it? So for me, in my own work, what I've argued is it does exactly that. It unwittingly forces animals to kind of hew to the line of what humans think is the right way to live. And then, of course, there's the question, how do we, who speaks for animals when they can't speak for themselves? And who decides what they do and do not get to do? And who decides whether cats get to eat eggs and so forth? Because that's something that they actually talk about in the book at one point. So Zoopolis is something that should be on your agenda, and it's a book that's worth reading, whether or not you end up agreeing with the thesis of it. Okay, that's been one of the most influential books in animal rights related discussions over the last 10 years or so. My own prediction, and I say this with all due respect to Will Kimmelman and Sue Donaldson, I think it's a dead end, and I don't think anybody's going to be talking about Zoopolis in another 10 years.
I mean, isn't it more? I mean, it seems to me that what they're trying to do is to say that we can have domesticated animals and it's okay, and there are sort of benign ways of dealing with them. I mean, in a sense,
that's right.
It really is not anything more than happy exploitation, but it takes several hundred pages for it. I don't really understand.
Yeah, I mean, the idea, Gary focuses this nicely. The idea is domestication, on their view, is perfectly fine as long as you do it in the right way. And the question is ultimately really, can you do domestication? Is there a right way to do domestication, or is that a kind of oxymoron? Right? In other words, what are the lives of domesticated animals actually concretely like? That's really, I think, the question becomes, right? The second thing I wanted to come back to is this. Is it okay to raise animals and kill them for human purposes if they led a happy life? And it's an interesting question. And it begs another question, which is, okay, we're the ones who are trying to answer that question. Can we be objective in answering it? Right? There are many questions about what's good for animals, what's in their interest, whether they benefit, how they benefit, that are being raised, and attempted answers are being offered by beings who are not impartial about the outcome in addressing these questions. Most human beings have a vested interest in answering those questions in such a way as to say it's perfectly okay to do these things to animals, to raise them, to treat them nicely, and so forth. However, we understand what it means to treat an animal nicely, to give it what it wants. I complained in one of the talks I gave about a year ago. I read this in the New York Times. I found it so attention-getting that I bookmarked it in my bookmarks in my browser. It was an article about Purdue, the chicken producer, saying that they were going to stop using antibiotics. That's probably 2 years ago now. And it was either the title of the article or kind of the lead line in it, that we're not just giving chickens what they need, we're giving them what they want. And this is one of the largest operators of chicken slaughterhouses in the galaxy. And I'm thinking to myself, what is it that chickens want? And it goes back to an expression that several of the speakers today have used, which is the expression happy meat. Have you heard this expression before? It's a fairly well-known expression. The idea of happy meat is the idea that you can raise animals for slaughter in a way that's benign. It doesn't harm the animals. And it really tries to sidestep the very proposition that Gary was talking about earlier, which is that death is a harm. Killing animals is a harm. Killing anybody is a harm, especially when it's not necessary, right? So my answer to the Inuit question is multiple. A, are there any Inuit here today? Anybody from Queens? Anybody in Inuit? I don't think so. And Sherry addressed this question, which is it comes up so often in talks that those of us who are panelists today give. What about the Inuit? What about those people in Tibet who are herders who can't grow anything and they're itinerant and occasionally they have to kill a goat or something to eat it? And my first answer is always, that is untrue of the vast majority of people in the world, and it's especially untrue of just about everybody who's in earshot of me right now. And that's what I think Sherry was getting at when she was sort of suggesting, I think it was Sherry who said, let's not use that as a reason or a kind of a justification for our own practices, because it's effectively like saying most of the confrontations we have with non-human animals are not lifeboat cases or burning house cases. Why should we treat them as if they are? And that's where I want to come back to what Gary Francione said, which is, what are the primary reasons that we can find, use, kill, and eat non-human animals? And Gary, I think, rightfully focuses on pleasure and convenience. There's also habit, and there's economic incentive, right? And what one has to ask, and this is where philosophy, I think, and just ethics goes beyond the merely practical, which is everything that is economically profitable for somebody justifiable for everybody? And it's a question that I think everybody has to answer this question with regard to animals, because everybody's lives are affected by the uses of non-human animals. So what it means to talk about happy meat, what it means to ask and try to answer the question, is it okay to kill animals if they had a happy life up till the time we killed them? These are problematic. So Peter Singer says, look, if you raise animals in comfortable circumstances where they have a relatively pleasant life and you kill them quickly and painlessly, it's okay. I call this the sneak up behind them when they're not looking and hit them over the head theory. Then it's perfectly okay. I go back to my principle from first thing this morning, which is if you wouldn't do it to a human, why would you do it to an animal? And I think Mike or Sherry was talking about this. You know, we raise our children. Does that mean that we get to kill them painlessly and eat them? And if we wouldn't do it to our own children, why would we do it to a cow or a pig or a chicken? Just because they look different than us? I mean, there's people who look different than us. We shouldn't be doing that too. So that's the second thing I wanted to come back to. The third one is this. I think Carl might have mentioned this earlier, and it had to do with the idea that in the Garden of Eden, it would appear that Adam and Eve are vegetarians. And this is controversial, but it's very interesting. A real watershed for thinking about animal rights and animal ethics are, let's say, the first 9 or so books of Genesis, or chapters of Genesis. And what you get in 1 through 4 is something very, very different than what you get in 8 and 9. 8 and 9 is where you have the flood and Noah making the covenant with God. And I think it is chapter 4 of Paradise Lost, Milton comes back to the Garden of Eden and he portrays it as a fruitful grainland, he calls it. And it's all vegetarian, everybody's just eating grain, and everything's very, very peaceful. You don't see any mention about human dominion over animals in the early books or chapters of Genesis. But in 8 and 9, that's where you get a shift from stewardship to dominion. It's no longer caring for animals and caring for nature. You now have this sort of dominion idea. And this is actually well after Adam and Eve have been expelled from the garden. If you look at that Masaccio painting from the 1400s of the expulsion from the garden, you see Adam and Eve looking absolutely mortified at what they've done and what is now being done to them, because the world is no longer a garden that provides for them. It's now a wilderness that they've got to carve their existence out of for themselves. And it's only in Genesis 8 and 9 that you first see any sign of animal sacrifice. And what we're told there is that God smells this and is made happy by the smell. He's satisfied by the animal sacrifice. And it's right there that Genesis states that God says to Noah, everything that creeps or crawls on the earth will have fear and dread of you. And it's a real significant change in our whole relationship to and orientation on our whole place in the natural order. And it goes back to that interesting statement that I mentioned from John Rawls, where he says, if you really want to have a sense of our moral relationship to animals or their moral status, you need a theory of nature and man's place in it. And that's what Genesis 8 and 9 give you. They give you a theory of nature and our place in it. And it's a position of dominion. Sherry?
So I think that the first chapter has dominion in it, but it's a very different kind of dominion. It's like you have the word dominion, and then you have like the next few sentences about you'll be eating grains and fruits and things like that. And so dominion as that you have power, but not that you can exercise in a domination sort of. And then you're right that later it becomes fear, that they'll fear you. And that this change that I thought was interesting to have the dominion statement come right before the vegan diet is prescribed. And almost anticipating people will hear, oh, we have dominion, now we can eat them. And sort of statement, no, actually, here's dominion, and this is what you eat, you don't eat them. And so dominion, and so the stewardship idea is almost part of what dominion meant initially, and then you have this extreme change to fear and eating.
Yeah, there's this other layer of this. Let me just introduce the Yahwist idea and then let you speak. We talked about this in the modern philosophy class a week or two ago when one of the students made a presentation on Descartes' views on non-human animals. And I did some research for my Descartes book many years ago about what's called the Yahwist conception of nature. And it turns out that people who study scripture, study the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Torah, have sort of parsed out different sections written by different writers. And there are principally 3 writers of the different sections, and it's not all chronological. It's not like it's first all one of them and then the next one and then the next one. It's kind of a pastiche that got put together by ostensibly by human hands. You've got the priestly writer, you've got the Elohist who refers to, so the priestly writer doesn't name God by name. The Elohist calls him Elohim, and the Yahwist calls him Yahweh. And it turns out that the priestly writer has really the dominion voice, the dominion in the hardcore sense voice. And it's the Yahwist who has the very pastoral voice. And that's the one who says that Adam came from the earth. And Adam comes from the word Abram, which means earth. So the soul comes from the earth. That's that very pastoral kind of earthy idea about where human beings come from and where they go back to. And it turns out that all the really animal-friendly statements that you find in Genesis, and in fact in all the early books of the Bible, come from the Yahwist voice. And the dominion ones come from the priestly writer. This is actually just an interesting kind of note to all of this. Carol?
Yeah, I would like to add to it. There are
Yes.
actually 2 creation accounts, which portray 2 different understandings of human existence. You're absolutely right about the Yahweh versus account. And biblical scholars actually often juxtapose these 2 views of humanity within the cosmos. They were actually written at different times in Israelite history. So they're actually reflected different cultural values. And so a lot of people don't know the Hebrew, read them as a seamless account, but they're 2 very different fascinating accounts. And they do represent these conflicting notions of the million over versus naming of the animals and all like that. So that's just part of the larger historical context of the entity.
Yeah, and just to give credit where credit is due, it was at an AAR meeting that I learned about the Yahwist conception of nature, American Academy of Religion. It wasn't from any philosopher. Interesting, now. Thanks, Carol. Carl, did you have anything?
Yeah, I think it was mentioned already, but I think a lot of people consider also the act of naming the animals some sort of dominion relationship. But I think I figure the change in mind totally dread, fear, and also then
Yeah. I mentioned my anthropocentrism book earlier. Chapter 5 is on the status of animals in medieval Christianity. In the late 1960s, a guy named Lynn White wrote an article, a very, very controversial article, and I think it was called The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Something like that. And as a matter of fact, actually, his work has been challenged by recent ecologists. That he sort of had a very naive or
That's interesting.
But yeah, he's very, he's certainly associated with this critical understanding of those earlier texts.
Right.
They're not considered to be myths, they're not considered to be literal.
Yeah, and I think so Lynn White's thesis was, if you want to know the historical roots of our ecological crisis, it's all about Christianity. And of course, many contemporary Christians who have environmental concern and concern about animals they find themselves in a very peculiar position if that thesis is correct. And what it led me to in chapter 5 of the Anthropocentrism book was an exploration of the question, how flexible is the meaning of Christianity? And it's all really a question of, do you want to go with, say, the Gospels or the New Testament plus the early fathers of the church? And how exactly do you want to define it? And how adaptable is it? It's almost kind of like, how do you interpret the United States Constitution? Strict constructionist or, it's a kind of flexible living document kind of approach. But one thing that is true, regardless of what your answer to that question is, if you look throughout the Christian Middle Ages, many of the dominant figures have this hardcore dominion view. So John Chrysostom and Basil of Caesarea and Origen, St. Thomas Aquinas, Augustine is a real prime offender on this. And even Martin Luther, not even Martin Luther, he has all kinds of horrible ideas about everybody, including some of the people in this room. But there's an overwhelming discourse of human dominion over non-human animals that terminates in the idea that it's very much like the Stoic view I mentioned this morning, according to which everything non-human was made for the sake of satisfying human needs and desires. Whether you want to pin that on Christianity or however you want to parse that historically, that is the historical prejudice that we are dealing with when we try to ask the question, why is it there aren't more vegans? Right? Because I think it has everything to do with that. The last thing I wanted to mention is, and then we can have a little more discussion, is this whole idea about self-awareness. Philosophers sometimes do go off into the weeds, and animal behaviorists as well. And the test that has become very popular, some of you know this, for answering the question whether certain animals, non-human animals, have self-awareness or not is called the mirror recognition test. Right? Putting an animal in front of a mirror, putting a typical way they do this, with higher primates, they'll put a red dot on its forehead. Now with dolphins, they have to do it differently. They smear something white or something. I forget exactly how they do it, but they smear something on their body and they put it in front of a mirror. And then in the case of beings with hand-like appendages, like the higher primates, if they put them in front of the mirror, they dab at the mirror, the conclusion of the researchers is this creature doesn't understand it's looking at itself, a reflection of itself. It thinks it's looking at something else or someone else, and it doesn't have self-awareness. Whereas if it dabs at its own forehead, it's considered to have self-awareness. There are relatively few non-human animals that have been judged to pass this test in a widely acknowledged way. Let's see, number of higher primates have passed this test, chimpanzees and bonobos, for example. Dolphins are now pretty widely accepted to have passed this test. There was a controversy about whether elephants do. It was first claimed that they did, and then the judgment was discredited, but there seems to be some increasing sense in the community, in the scientific community, that elephants do pass this test. And I just say this, dolphins do as well. But one could always ask the question, why take that kind of test as definitive of whether a being has a sense of self? Think of what Gary said about a person with what's called transient global amnesia. They have a sense of self, even if they're locked in a kind of eternal present. Beings, any being, this is my thinking about this, any being that knows to fight with its claws rather than its tail has a sense of self. Any being that, so my cat Pindar, that I mentioned earlier today, unfortunately is no longer with us, was a very, very clever manipulator of me. And he had a very good sense of when I was likely to get up in the morning, and he would start to go to work on me about an hour before that. Any of you who live with cats know how this works, and I think this works with some dogs too. He'd go to work on me, and what he would do is he was not a lap cat, but I'd be sleeping on my back and he'd get right on my chest and get his face right up against mine. And then he'd take one claw and in a very gentle way pick at my cheek, very gently, just enough to wake me up. So it wasn't like he was slapping me, although he occasionally did that as a play invitation. But it wasn't like he was drawing blood or clawing or whacking or anything like that. He had a very subtle sense of exactly how much harm he could do with his claws to somebody who didn't have skin like his. That it's very hard to separate perceptual awareness from reflexive self-awareness. And if you know that your body works in that way, and you know how to interact with other beings in that way, it's very hard to separate that logically from the sense of, I'm a self among other entities and other beings in the world, and I have a relationship to them. What makes it tempting for humans to suppose that non-human animals don't have self-awareness is the fact that it doesn't appear outwardly to us that non-human animals can conceptualize and think linguistically about the idea, I am an individual among other individuals who have rights and obligations that are comparable to mine and with whom I can have reciprocal relationships. In fact, it's all but impossible for us to be able to tell or come up with a story that seems plausible about what the encounter with existence is like for a being that doesn't have human language, precisely because we can't get outside of our own language long enough to sort of conceptualize or get a sense of what that would be like, except perhaps in very rare moments, and this is what some philosophers tell you, you can't get outside of language. I'll tell you that I think that's baloney. There's plenty of ways we get outside of language, but we have to kind of turn off the will in order to do it. And we find ourselves in those childlike moments of peace and repose in sub-linguistic states of awareness. And I think that's where perhaps we become most intimately aware of what it might be like to be a non-linguistic sentient being. Right? Mike?
So, two thoughts, and that'll. So one is, Tom Nagel wrote this very famous essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, which is often misrepresented by people who haven't read it as standing for the proposition that we can never know what it's like to be a bat, which is not what he says. What he says is we can't know what it's like to have certain perceptions that are unique to or different. So echolocation is his example. Right. And it's not even for the point of saying that. Part of the essay is about the difference between having a subjective experience and feeling it from the inside versus being able to describe it. But in any event, so that connects to this question, I think, of what the bridging between different experiences. I think it's interesting that our morality and our law recognize that the sort of most fundamental way you can violate somebody's human rights are exactly to do things that we do to animals that they do share with us. So, for example, torture, right? That is, even countries that practice the death penalty don't officially practice torture. And torture is defined as the infliction of severe pain or the anticipation of severe pain. And so that's something we do share. It's not like echolocation. It's not like language or something. And the death penalty, right, which is not practiced by most civilized countries. Again, that's something we do to other animals. And so, in a sense, it almost seems like the introduction of these other capacities, whether they're ones we have and other animals lack or vice versa, seems irrelevant to the sort of fundamental moral questions about the things we are doing where we are similarly situated. So I wanted to bring Kimlicka back into the discussion.
Yeah, can I just say something about that, just so everybody knows? So Thomas Nagel in the 1970s wrote this very famous article called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And the ultimate sort of quarry, philosophical concern in the essay is not really about the nature of consciousness so much as how to solve the mind-body problem. And he says something very interesting at the end of that essay that I keep coming back to. One day, eventually, it'll be like Tolstoy's Ivan Illich on the deathbed will know the answer to this question. It's how are mind and body related to each other? And he says, it's possible that the answer or the solution to the mind-body problem will involve concepts that are themselves neither purely mental nor purely physical. which is a really interesting way to approach this. It's to say maybe dualism was a mistake in the first place. What Mike is talking about, the way this comes up in animal ethics discussions a lot is Nagel says, look, a rough and ready answer to the question, what is it like to be a bat, is we're not in a position really to say, because the nature of our perceptual encounter is so different than a bat's, because a bat uses echolocation, we typically don't, although people who don't have sight do use, I've heard a fascinating story on NPR a couple of years ago when I was driving down to see Gary down in Melbourne, actually, and it was about a guy who used clicking sounds and so forth, and this has become a thing among people. But and also some people have pushed back on Nagel and said, no, actually our perceptual encounters are in many ways very much like the bats. The important takeaway that Nagel offers is this. He says, look, you can't really come up with a definition of consciousness or subjective awareness that goes any more precise than this. To say that a being is conscious or has subjective states of awareness means there's something that it's like to be that being. And, you know, for analytic philosophers, this is kind of annoying and, you know, it's like D work for an undergraduate. But, for people who've really thought about this seriously and have a kind of open-minded view about the, mysterious notions like consciousness, one might actually acknowledge that may be as good as it gets. To say that to have subjective states of awareness means it's like something. It's like, whatever it is that it's like for me, whatever you could take out of that, that's what it's like for any sentient being. And I think that's a very, very important thing. What was the point about Kim? And then, Carl, hang on one sec. What was the point about Kimlin?
So, maybe why don't I hold off on it? Okay, it opens up a whole other.
Okay, let's do that. Maybe we can do it in the round table later. Carl, go ahead.
It was interesting that you mentioned about the dots in the head. Do you know if they did those experiments with young children, babies?
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Somebody has gotten NSF money to do that, sure. Because we were talking about inclined plane experiments with infants and things like that, where they figure out a sense of spatial depth and so forth. So many things have been examined. I'd be surprised if that hadn't been.
It has been done. There was a group, I think, in Denver that did it at that pediatric hospital.
The dots on the forehead?
Yeah.
And did you know the results?
I can't, you're pulling stuff out.
I'm going to take a wild guess. I'm going to play armchair behaviorist, and I'm going to say they figure that on average it's around a certain age that self-awareness emerges. Something like that.
Yes.
That's a good idea.
So 18 to 24 months.
What are you saying?
I heard 18 to 24 months.
That sounds legit. I mean, it's amazing. You start reading Piaget, and you start developing causal inferences around that time. So, Gary.
John Griffin, who I think is thought to be the founder of the study of animal consciousness.
And co-discoverer of echolocation.
He took the position, and I think he was right, that any animal that's perceptually aware has some level of self-awareness because the animal knows that that animal is, that he or she is not the animal that sees another animal climbing on the tree and knows that, on some level that it's not he or she who's spying. And so, I think we spend an enormous amount of time trying to determine whether or not they think like us. And that seems to me to be completely irrelevant. That as long as they have, to say they are sentient means that they prefer, desire, or want to continue to live. And that's really all we need to know. How they view that, whether it's similar to the way that we view it, whether they are self-aware, and I'm sure that non-human animals, most of them, but my guess is they're not. They don't have autobiographical self-awareness the way we do. But who cares? How is that relevant to the simple question, am I morally justified in treating this being exclusively as a resource for my use? That's the only question. That to me is the question. And the focus on what sort of cognition and the quality of cognition and the extent, strikes me as just being irrelevant.
Right. You know, it's interesting. Gary's talking about having a desire, say, for continued existence or an interest in continued existence. One way that some philosophers have tried to deny this to non-human animals is to say, look, in order to have interests, you have to have beliefs and desires. Hare may say this. You have to have beliefs and desires. But beliefs and desires are predicatively structured. In other words, they involve concepts and like subject-predicate forms of language. And any being that lacks language can't have beliefs and desires. Therefore, and if animals don't have language, they can't have desire.
And anybody who would say that has never lived.
Well, this is an interesting point because, number one, yes. I mean, anybody who's spent much time with animals, especially if you have companion animals where your defenses are down and you're not going into it, looking to deny that animals have subjective states of awareness, you form relationships and you see that your companion animals, just like you, have moods and dispositions and likes and dislikes and things that scare you irrationally and all of this. And that there's ways of behaving rationally or irrationally, whether or not you're human and linguistic. I once mentioned to my veterinarian, some of you know her, Steve Stoll, Gary Hardcastle's spouse. He's a philosophy professor down at Bloom. I mentioned to her that some philosophers say that animals don't really have long-term memory and don't anticipate the future. And she got really bent out of shape immediately and said, spend 5 minutes in any veterinary emergency room and you will know that animals remember their pain. That kind of takes it down to the nub, I think. I mean, it kind of gets right to the point of it, which is this idea, and I mentioned it before, Donald Griffin was the pioneer of what's called cognitive ethology. Also, I believe was either like an uncle or father-in-law of Ben Marsh here at Bucknell. And he came here and spoke many, many years ago in the early years at Bucknell. Up till the time of cognitive ethology, the default position was called behavioral ethology. It was influenced by people like B.F. Skinner and the notion of behaviorism. And behaviorism gets it deserves a bad rap, but it gets an even worse one than it actually merits, because many people say, well, behaviorists deny that there's anything inner in our experience. That is not true. Doug Kennedy, the emeritus animal behavior and psychology professor at Bucknell, brilliant man, will tell you, Skinner and the behaviorists never denied that there are inner states. All they said was they are irrelevant to scientific descriptions of behavior, and you should not take recourse to them. And Skinner was actually, then I thought, okay, is Doug right about this? Turns out he's right. The important thing is this. The way that got kind of played out in animal behavior was the sort of cheerful, tacit assumption that animals don't have inner states of awareness. And it became this very Cartesian game of saying it's just external behavior without any subjective states of awareness at all. The next thing you know, everybody's thinking, well, even when animals scream, it's just like a tea kettle whistling or something, because they don't really know that anything's happening to them. It's like the idea of having pain without subjectively being aware of being in pain. The move to cognitive ethology, pioneered by Griffin, went a little bit to the other extreme, but maybe for a good reason, and that is the default position for cognitive ethology is there is thinking and reasoning and planning and reckoning in animals. And you find Griffin saying things like, and this is almost verbatim, that when pigeons are, pecking these devices in lab situations to get rewards, he says, the pigeon is thinking something like, pecking this thing gets me food. Now, I don't know if you really want to go quite that far, but there is some non-linguistic equivalent of that in what Gary's talking about when he says animals want things. Okay, we only know how to describe wanting or desiring things in predicative terms like, I want that something take place. And we can only describe belief in linguistic terms such as, I believe that it is raining, or I believe that it is Saturday, something like that. And it goes back to that problem of how do you undo or get beneath linguistically structured formulations of mental states so that you understand that there can be mental states that aren't linguistically structured. Yeah, there's a lot there. Sure.
So one of the things that comes up sometimes is that argument over whether taking an animal's life is a deprivation or not. And of course, if we're claiming that existence is a harm to the animal, on some level it becomes somewhat paradoxical for us to say that taking their life is a harm because isn't non-existence better? Didn't we just say that it's better, and so killing them is a good thing? And I think, one, like Gary said earlier, that the whole point of sentience is life, but it's hard to work with that answer because you could say evolutionarily that the whole point of life is reproduction. And from an evolutionary point of view, that might be so, but that's certainly not how an individual being will perceive it. So I think it's hard to answer it, but one answer for me is that non-existence is different when it comes after a life than when it's come before. That coming into existence is not a benefit, but taking something away that you already have is kind of an endowment effect or something like that. That taking away an existence that we already have is a harm. That every being wants to remain, not every being, but many beings want to remain alive, even if they are not benefited by having become alive in the first place. And then, of course, slaughter is not painless, in fact. So, but I don't know. I mean, what's your thinking about, like, how do you simultaneously maintain that they shouldn't have come into existence, but that it's wrong to take away their existence?
I have to confess a certain difficulty with. I don't formulate philosophical questions that way, and so it's hard for me to answer them in a way that sounds semi-intelligent. And for many years, I thought there was something wrong with me because I couldn't or wouldn't formulate philosophical questions of a certain kind, because everybody else was doing it, and I felt kind of left out in the cold. The way I think about this is like this. Peter Singer, in the third edition of Practical Ethics, has this question about whether being alive just in and of itself is a good thing, and he leaves the question unanswered. But he does make this he raises this interesting question, which is, look, if et ceteris paribus, all other things being equal, being alive is better than not being alive, then do we have a duty to bring lots and lots of lives into existence? And he never answers the question, but what's interesting about that question is, think of all the practical questions that raises. Like, are we at 7 billion people right now? I think when I was born in the mid-1950s, weren't there like 1 or 2 billion? Or less than 2 billion people, I think, on the face of the earth. So the world population is more than tripled. And that...
So Pinker's right, things have gotten much better.
Exactly. Yeah, how many kids does he have? Yeah, Stephen Pinker. I don't know if from a cosmic standpoint it even makes sense to talk about these in these sort of quantitative terms. And so I tend to be more inclined in my own style of thinking and feeling about things just to kind of confront things I think the way you're talking about, which is let's talk about who's here now. And let's not talk about these sort of really far-fetched hypotheticals about who might exist, who doesn't exist. This is in a class of philosophical questions that philosophers call counterfactuals, right? Which is things that are any kind of consideration about something that is not actually true or the case. Like, if we brought more people into existence, such and such would happen, something like that. I don't know how to deal with a question like that, and I don't know that I'd much rather deal with the question. How should we live? I mean, this is a whole different kind of question, a question of a different order. How should we live? What does it mean to lead a good life? What does it mean to opt for peace rather than violence? What was right in Hesiod's idea? What was right in Epicurus' idea? And how can I separate that out from what was wrong in their ideas? Which is, if a peaceful existence is what is incumbent upon us, if it's part of the ideal that I want to embrace for living, then there's no place in it for bringing creatures into existence, who are destined to be used or otherwise exploited and ultimately killed. And I don't know if this is just a limitation of my own ability to think, but I can't get past that way of thinking about the problem. But what are you after in that I may not have addressed?
I guess what I'm after is just the answer to the claim that killing painless, like if somebody like Peter Singer says killing an animal painlessly does the animal no harm, then Jeremy Bentham says it does them no harm, whatever, that, and I think no it does, can I make that argument if the death is really painless, can I make that argument? Consistent with saying that these animals should never have come into existence.
Do you want to address this one?
Yeah, the reason why Singer says that is he says that non-humans are not self-aware, but his understanding of self-awareness begs the question from the outset. The only sort of self-awareness that he thinks is more relevant is the self-awareness that a normal human adult has. And that strikes me as begging the question. I mean, to say, well, they're not self-aware, so you're not harming them. The answer is, well, they're not self-aware in the same way that humans are, but that doesn't mean they're not self-aware. And if one's valuing of life depends on self-awareness, one could make the argument that any and I make it and I believe it, that any sentient being is self-aware and more relevant, like you're saying they have an interest in continuing living. I would also say that continued living is in the interest of a sentient being, even if the being doesn't sort of think it is in my interest. That is, I find nothing peculiar about the locution to say that it is in the interest of a sentient being to continue to live. Even if that being lives, which I don't believe is the case, but assuming arguendo that being lives in an eternal present, I still think that that being has an interest in getting from second to second to second to second of consciousness. I will also say, there's also plenty of behavior. For example, it's very common for an animal stuck in a trap to gnaw away at his or her limb to get away and to inflict great pain on himself or herself in order to continue to live. There have been studies, I think they're horrible studies, but they have shown that fish have benzodiazepine receptors and that they do feel pain when they have a hook in their mouth. When I was growing up, why go fishing? They don't care. They pull when they've got the hook in their mouth, so therefore it can't hurt them. And the answer is, well, apparently it does hurt them, but they have less. They have benzodiazepine receptors, which they would not have if they did not feel anxiety. So there's some sort of fear going on in that situation. Having been in probably 30 slaughterhouses in my life, I can tell you that animals sense immediately even before specific pain starts, they are very frightened. You say, well, that's just a smell of blood, it's smell of the sun. He says, I don't care. It doesn't really matter. They understand that there is a threat to their lives. And so I find it peculiar that anyone really questions. I don't want to say you are. I'm saying I find it peculiar that anyone questions that animals have an interest. And, years ago, Peter Singer and I were debating some vivisectors at Hahnemann Medical School in Philadelphia. And it was supposed to be Peter and I debating the vivisectors, and it ended up Peter and I debating each other. Because the vivisector said, well, we don't want to use animals when it's absolutely necessary. We treat them humanely. But Peter said, well, I don't have a problem with that. I said, well, I do. I feel free to explain why. And we got into this discussion, and it was very interesting because it was the first time I really understood that he really believes that sort of you can't look at yourself in the mirror and sort of saying I'm having a bad hair day or something. You don't count. You just don't count. And you're not self-aware, and therefore killing you is not inflicting harm. I find it such a peculiar and counterintuitive sort of way of thinking, and it just fits really nicely if you want to continue to exploit animals and promote the exploitation of animals, which Peter does. And so, I don't know. it's all very bad, but I do think we need to get away from this idea that animals are, that they have to be self-aware in the way that we are. Because I know that they're not self-aware in the way, I don't know how they're self-aware. I mean, Gary, talks about equivalence. And who was that Russian guy that you...
Vygotsky.
Yeah. Gary talks about this idea of there being equivalent. And I agree. I think that's clear. We don't know what it is because we can't understand it, but it's very, very clear. And you and I, who live with, dogs. I mean, for God's sake. I mean, if someone were to say to me, "Do you think your dogs are self-aware?" That would strike me as peculiar as a question. Do they have tails? And the answer is, you watch their behavior, look at them, and then tell me that they're not self-aware. How are they self-aware? Got no idea. They don't use words. No idea. It's a mystery.
Yeah, no, I agree with, I certainly agree with you that they're self-aware, and I actually, I wasn't premising the question on the proposition that they're not self-aware. I was saying that it's, not saying or perhaps somebody else might say, well, if we really snuck up behind them and killed them without their realizing it, we're not setting back their interests because they didn't realize it was coming.
Well, it would be different. I mean, look, if I snuck up behind you and while you were having an otherwise good time and blew your brains out, you wouldn't know it hit you. Right. And, you wouldn't suffer any pain and you'd be dead. Have I harmed you? The answer is, well, yes, I have. How have I harmed you?
It's very hard. I think it's very hard to explain.
Well,
I agree with you.
I've harmed Michael.
Right,
Actually, those are constantly, I've harmed children, I've harmed them. But let's assume Michael doesn't exist, and your kids hate you, and you're, so let's assume nobody cares. How have I harmed you? He says, well, I deprived you of continuing to exist, which if you didn't want to do, you would have made a different decision and things. This was something that I used to argue with Tom about because he has the dog and the lifeboat example that you're just talking about, and we would say, well, dogs just have fewer opportunities for satisfaction. I would say to Tom, sure, dogs enjoy doing the most incredibly goofy things, and they get great pleasure out of it. I frankly think my dogs have many more opportunities for satisfaction than I do. As a matter of fact, I hope I come back as a dog in my house. And because I think they have plenty of opportunities. But we have this idea that, we're not really, if I kill you painlessly, I deprive you of your intellectual, because this is very much the theories of philosophers, that, the pleasures of the mind are so wonderful, and if I deprive you of them, I harm you. The answer is, great. If I kill the dog painlessly, that's better than torturing the dog. But I still deprive the dog or the chicken or the fish of the experiences that being finds valuable on however his or her, on his or her terms, however those are. And I don't understand.
Can I say something about this just to elaborate on it? So the debate is about whether death is a harm to non-human animals versus humans, or whether death is a harm to beings that are not self-aware versus beings that are self-aware. And the way that Singer, the utilitarian, argues for this is in the following way. He says, beings that don't have self-awareness are what he calls replaceable. Or he says that humans, or beings that are self-aware, are not replaceable. And replaceable means you can actually compensate for the loss from killing the replaceable one, like the non-self-conscious animal, by bringing another one into existence. The thinking implicitly being that replaceable ones that aren't self-aware, are basically like kind of fungible units, right? They're just like anonymous things that, as long as you bring another tree into existence, it replaces one that was just cut down. Another way that Singer puts the point is this. He says for a being that is not self-conscious, so one that he's treating as replaceable, he says dying for a replaceable being, or a being that's not self-aware, is like going to sleep and never waking up. But he wants to say that for a being that's self-aware, it's a greater loss. It's a different kind of loss. And he doesn't know how to explain what it is either. But he says beings that are self-aware, when they die, there's a kind of loss that is a different order of magnitude than the loss of a being whose death is like going to sleep and just not ever waking up. And the mystery of this, just not to take this down to the level of psychology too much, but anybody who's thought much about life and death and sleep has always wondered, what would it be like if I go to sleep tonight and I never wake up? The termination of my consciousness, not just the temporary interruption of it. And it's a mystery. I don't know that there's a reason to expect that we should know how to explain what that loss means or what it is. Levi, what were you going to say?
I was just thinking of how the idea of being replaceable made me think of how corporations see unskilled workers. Like they mean nothing to them. Right? Amazon or McDonald's or Walmart, they're totally replaceable.
Yeah, it's like that Marxian surplus army of laborers, right? Of proletarians, right? Yeah, it is like that. It is like that. So,
I mentioned the Bible earlier. That in the story of Job, Job's children are replaced. This is why.
Because we're all happy when the new people come along.
Yeah,
We lost his whole family.
is that like Abraham kicking Hagar out of the house too, or is that different?
No, well, there is a sense of loss. I mean, the story of Job, right? Most people think is written by an atheist or a skeptic. But in the story, there's this ending, like, and everything lives happily ever after. The way he does is, well, he gets like a whole new family, and it's all sort of good again.
Yeah, interesting. So listen, why don't we do this in the interest of time? We've got scheduled here a roundtable discussion from 3:30 to 5. It doesn't have to go the whole time if we don't want. But here's what I want to suggest. Why don't we take 15 minutes? I'm told the coffee got replenished. If Gary didn't drink it all. And why don't we get coffee and chat with each other? I would just ask anybody who wants to stay, and I hope you'll all stay for it. Gary was suggesting we put the chairs in a circle. And that everybody just think about one thing that you'd like to bring to the discussion. I always say this to my students, and it never works, but this time it's going to work. We're all just going to bring something. And like, what brought you here, or what made you curious or interested in this topic? Or where do you come to this? Where do you meet this? What are your misgivings or your questions or your convictions? And let's just round up at about 3:30, and we'll just have a roundtable discussion where everybody just talks. Is that okay?
The plan.
Okay.